The West Highland Line, opened in 1894, connects Glasgow in the Scottish Lowlands to the Lochaber region of the Highlands, and is generally regarded as one of Britain's most scenic railway routes. Not only that, today the line is seen as one of the top railway journeys in the world, seeing surging popularity year on year as international tourists flock on board the daily ScotRail service trains which operate to Fort William, Oban and Mallaig. It's 141 miles of railway all in all single track, with the main Glasgow-Fort William route connecting with an extension to Mallaig, which hugs the coast, plus another route out west to Oban. Oban was the first town to be reached by the railway back in 1880, followed in 1894 by the main line to Fort William, followed lastly by Mallaig in 1901. For all its world-famous celebrity status today, the West Highland Line is still what it was set out to be in those early days, a working railway. Aside from all the tourist traffic, it's a lifeline for isolated hamlets and villages, some of which have little or no access to the main roads. Then there is the weather. Driving rain and wind, which typifies the west of Scotland throughout winter, heavy snow and ice, and all on the blackest of nights across the bleak wastelands of Rannoch Moor. The high altitude of the line makes for heavy gradients and sharp reverse curves, providing the ultimate test for drivers of passenger and freight trains. The West Highland Line truly is a marvel of Victorian engineering, and there has of course been a lot written about the railway over the years, and I suppose you could say a couple of the more notable authors would be Dr John McGregor or Michael Pearson, and I've of course got several of their books in my collection. While I'm talking today about the history of the railway, I'm going to be quite often referencing one other particular book, and that would be this one, The West Highland Lines Post-Beeching. You may of course have noticed my name on the book there. I am of course the author. I'm here of course to talk about the history of the railway, but I just wanted to give that a brief mention. You've got to take the opportunity to promote your own product of course. It's published by the History Press, £16.99, available in all major or smaller bookshops as well, and I will be making mention of that as we go along. Now there's many reasons that I wanted to do a documentary exploring the history of the West Highland Line, and I guess my interest in the railway actually started at the age of about 3 or 4. Back then I watched a video, I had a video in my collection, a VHS, I think it was called The West Highland Line, the World's Greatest Railway Journey. Not only, like a lot of people, do have a keen interest in the West Highland Line, but I'm lucky enough to be able to say that I've actually lived around the periphery of the West Highlands for pretty much all my life. The entirety of the west of Scotland, all the way down from the Highlands and Islands, down the Firth of Clyde, closer to where I am. It's a fantastic part of the world, there's so much to see and do. It does have its drawbacks, there's the weather. Welcome to summer in the West Highlands. The transport links aren't the greatest, but most of the people are friendly. It attracts millions of visitors every single year. Well, if you thought midges were bad enough, it's flying ant day as well in the West Highlands. Now, if you know anything about the railway, you might have frequently heard of it being referred to as the Iron Road to the Isles, or just the Road to the Isles. You might often see that with the West Highland Mallaig extension. Now, when people talk about the West Highland Line, they're often referring to the whole 141 miles of railway which runs north of Craigendoran Junction, serving Oban, Fort William and Mallaig. The Mallaig extension line and the Oban line, they are of course beautifully scenic railway journeys in their own right, and I will be mentioning them, but today I'm here to talk about the real West Highland Line itself, which is the section of line which makes up the bulk of that 141 miles, and it takes passengers from Glasgow up to Fort William. 23rd of October 1889 saw the first sod cut on the West Highland Railway at Fort William, and the next few years would see the line built over an uncompromising landscape of mountain, moor and loch. The contractors had to adhere to a tight budget and very difficult access due to the absence of even basic roads in the area, led by the engineers Formans and McCall of Glasgow. The hostile terrain resulted in not only the gradients but some spectacular feats of engineering, notably bridges and viaducts, but the railway company's limited budget meant that this was not always possible, and the permanent way had to follow the lie of the land. After a serious financial crisis, track line was eventually completed, and 7th of August 1894 saw the West Highland Railway opened to Fort William, starting its own way north at Craigendoran Junction near Helensburgh, where it left the Glasgow suburban network. Trains were operated by the North British Railway, carrying not only passengers but supplies that used to come up by road, such as the Morning Post and newspapers. Winding up Loch Lomond into Crianlarich, where the West Highland crossed over the Caledonian Railway's line to Oban, the descent from the County March summit saw the railway skirt the flanks of Ben Oer and Ben Doran. The line almost doubled back in itself here, forming the unique horseshoe curve into the Och Glen. This precedes a sustained climb onto Rannoch Moor, Britain's last true wilderness, with practically no civilization for the best part of 50 square miles. The hard-working Victorian navvies found the land so waterlogged that the railway had to be floated across the moor on a special track bed of brushwood, tree roots, ash and soil. A lengthy viaduct still had to be built leaving Rannoch Station, as the line climbs to its highest point at Currower Summit, 1,350 feet above sea level. The single platform halt at Currower is the highest railway station in the United Kingdom, and probably the most remote. This precedes the final leg of the West Highland Line, downhill all the way to Fort William, via Tulloch and Spian Bridge. The Oban line headed north from Stirling via Callander and was a separate entity to the West Highland, so it was not until 1897 that a connecting spur was laid between the two at Crianlarich. The village had two stations here, with Crianlarich Upper on the West Highland and Crianlarich Lower on the Oban line. A few years later, the Mallaig extension route was opened, which paved the way not only for more local passenger services, but a direct link for the fish trade, which was one of the main sources of goods traffic down the whole route to Glasgow for many years. The Mallaig line was spectacular in its own right, and following the 1923 grouping of the big four railway companies, the entire route between here and Glasgow was taken over by the London and North Eastern Railway, the LNER. The Oban line, on the other hand, was operated by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, and the two had something of a rivalry for many years, though World War II brought the two companies closer together, as the West Highland Line also saw considerable military traffic. A double-track branch line was built to Faslane Naval Base, while to the north, the Mallaig extension was effectively commandeered by the armed forces and the Secret Service during this time for commando training operations. 1948 saw the creation of British Railways, BR for short, and steam power continued to dominate. Nationalisation resulted in LMS Stanair Class 5 spreading from the Oban line to the West Highland also, working trains alongside the K1, K2 and K4 moguls of the LNER, though dieselisation beckoned by the early 1960s. Across the country, steam was being phased out and BR were investing heavily in their modernisation plan against increased car usage and competition from the roads, which saw Dr Richard Beeching elected to become chairman of the board. His 1963 report estimated the company was running at a loss of £140 million a year and targeted the rural railways, which he said simply were not generating enough revenue to cover their own operating costs. So yes, if you haven't guessed it already, remote lines like the West Highland were high in his agenda, as the route was only seeing a handful of passenger services using it every day, running through some of the lowest populated villages in the country, and at the same time employing hundreds of train crew, signalling staff, track engineers and other personnel, not to mention the high cost of maintaining the large amount of structures along the way. With such a vastly improving road network, could the West Highland Line survive? (1963) saw the entire line from Craigendoran to Fort William and Mallaig recommended for closure, along with Inverness to Kyle of Loco-hauled. But all the roads in the Highlands, although busier, were still nowhere near robust enough to handle all the extra car, bus and lorry traffic, and a lot of it was still single track, particularly the road to the Isles to Mallaig. Ultimately, it was industry in Lochaber that would be the saving grace when a contract was signed for trains to transport paper to the new Wigan Steep pulp and paper mill at Corpach near Fort William. Extra daily freight trains were introduced and the West Highland lived to fight another day, as did the route to Kyle. The Callander and Oban line was not so lucky, and 1965 saw track lifted on the entire ex-Caledonian Railway route from Crianlarich to Dunblane. The rest of the line to Oban via Dalmally survived, but trains would now take the main West Highland route north via Ardlough. Crianlarich Lower Station shut, though its goodyard remained in use for another 25 years for the loading of timber trains to Corpach. Eventually the track here was lifted too, and the site today has given way to a car park and housing, while part of the track bed survives as a cycle path, cutting under the West Highland Line. Crianlarich Lower Junction was where the two railways once joined. On the left is the Callander and Oban, which is essentially a long overgrown siding. On the right is the connecting cord which joins the West Highland Line, and it's this part of the line which remains in use for passenger trains today. 1965 saw this come into play, with all Oban trains now starting their journey at Glasgow Queen Street, following the closure of the old Glasgow Buchanan Street. 1965 also saw the closure of the Cullen branch line on the Callander and Oban. Then in 1966 the Connell Ferry to Ballachulish branch was also removed. Steam would not feature in the new British Rail era, and 1963 saw the railway completely taken over by a variety of Bobo diesel electric locomotives. The North British Type 2 class were unreliable and very short-lived in the end, but much more successful were the Type 2 class built by the Birmingham Railways Carriage and Wagon Company, later to be known as the Class 27s. The 27s would hold a near monopoly on this side of the Scottish rail network for the next 20 years. The 1970s was a healthy decade for the West Highland Line in many ways, and there even still remained a curious amount of nighttime goods trains known as the Ghosts. Fort William was a thriving freight hub, one particular site being Corpach on the Mallaig line, where timber would be supplied in, pulped down to finished paper, and went out back by rail at the other end. Daily fuel oil trains also ran for many years, plus traffic to and from the British aluminium plant on the outskirts of town. Passenger facilities, on the other hand, were not so good at the fort, with the terminus station beside Loch Linnhe gradually becoming more cramped, and a decision was made to build an entire new station a short distance to the east. The The line was cut back slightly with the new station opening in 1975, controlled by colour light signals from Mallaig Junction Box. The West Highland Line, of course, attracts a huge amount of hill walkers, mountain climbers and other outdoor sports enthusiasts, and today I'm at the northern edge of Loch Long, and just over my shoulder there is the Cobbler, or Ben Arthur as is its proper name, one of the popular Munros in the area. Out of all the walking trails in the area, the most notable is obviously the West Highland Way, which starts back at Milngavie on the outskirts of Glasgow and goes all the way up to Fort William. It's an area so rich with wildlife as well, even the southern section of the West Highland Line alone, as here there's red squirrels, there's pine martens, especially as you get further north, and once you get onto Rannoch Moor, there's a lot of birds of prey, red deer, which are seen very commonly from the train, rare insects. It's an incredible part of the world. Now, one of the reasons I'm next to this particular section of line today is because this is really the main artery of the West Highlands, because this is the section south of Crean-Larich, which of course from 1965 became busier. The train services were almost doubled because the Oban trains no longer run via Callander, instead started running from Glasgow Queen Street up to Crean-Larich that way. The West Highland Lines are of course very far north in the United Kingdom, so very far from headquarters, and certainly into the 1970s still run at a very local level. And this was very important because it does of course run through a lot of hostile and remote territory, and the railway was the only means of transport for many people, certainly until the 1980s when there started to be big improvements to the local roads in the Highlands. West Highland train crews have always been known for their friendly nature, and that continues very much to this day, certainly well into the diesel era, and this includes both the Oban and the Fort William trains, which use this same section of line. Used to regularly make a lot of unofficial stops actually, and that might have arguably continued even longer past the 1970s. The remote villages along the line were of course very far from the city, or even Fort William or Oban for that matter, and a very common thing was for the drivers and second men of the locomotives to deliver shopping to local people. Quite near this section of the line, for example, near Aricher, there was quite a remote cottage, maybe on the outskirts of the village, where a former driver who's a friend of mine reports that they used to regularly drop off shopping for this lady that lived there, who was obviously quite far from Glasgow, and in return she used to regularly give the train crew some home baking, so that was very nice. Further north, where the railway gets really remote, of course, along the edge of the glen near the Horseshoe Curve, one of the daily trains used to quite often stop, and a lady who lived along that section of line used to actually board the train via a ladder in the middle of the glen. It was amazing. Even, I presume, that would entail the train stopping in the middle of the gradient, but that was quite a regular thing, and she would go down and she would get her shopping in Glasgow and be dropped off on the return. The situation escalates even further because in the 1970s, well into this decade, there was a regular train which ran from Oban to Glasgow Queen Street, and it would carry typically a parcels van, and often it would have an extra van added, and this van would be used on occasion to carry dead bodies to Glasgow, to go to the city mortuary or to go to funerals. Can you imagine that? In today's railway, with the health and safety we have today, we're talking about a passenger train carrying dead people in the same train. It's amazing. But of course, the thing to remember here is the railway was the most direct means of transport in those days, and it would be used to carry anything and everything really. If you're to look at the books of Michael Pearson, another West Highland Line author, I mean, he recounts countless tales of the hospitality of the train crews and real stories about things that they would do for the locals. Of course, to look at it from a health and safety and an emergency perspective, the railway ran through the middle of Rannoch Moor for mile after mile, so of course even today I think trains carry emergency flares and extra supplies. The fantastic local spirit of the West Highlands would prevail for many years to come, but by 1983 they had another obstacle to overcome: Serpol. Commissioned by Margaret Thatcher's government, this latest report about the future prospects of the BR network came came 20 years after Beeching and, ludicrously, recommended the closure of the entire West Highland rail network north of Crianlarich. Opposition spawned the Friends of the West Highland Lines Society, who spearheaded the defeat of this proposal. The idea was eventually shot down, but just like in 1963, the Serpil report would spark vast changes to the way the railway was operated north of the border, and from this came ScotRail. ScotRail was the new brand name given to the former BR Scottish region, and with it came observation carriages, Sunday excursion trains, and other measures to open up the West Highland Line's tourist potential, which had been neglected for some years. By this time, Class 27s had been dropped in favour of more powerful Type 3 traction. The new locomotives, Class 37s, were the product of English Electric and had actually been in service for BR for some 20 years also, though considerable permanent way upgrades were required to permit their West Highland Line introduction. By the mid-1980s, there had been big upgrades to the Highland Trunk roads, but ScotRail was doing very well, under the stewardship of new manager Chris Green, and summer excursion trips were in operation on the Fort William-Mallaig and Mallaig lines. Land cruise trains included the Royal Scotsman and others such as the West Highlander operated by Intercity, which would continue into the 1990s. But the big event of the decade was when the diesel-hauled trains to Mallaig were partly replaced by steam. The summer of 1984 saw two preserved Class 5s move to Fort William, joined by ex-North British Railway 060 Mod, for a series of special workings operated by ScotRail to Mallaig. The trains were hugely successful and went on to feature every following summer, and have actually continued right up until the present day. October 1987 also saw steam return to the main line to Fort William, when one of the Black Fives, number 5305, worked a southbound rail tour to Edinburgh. The Scottish Railway Preservation Society went on to operate similar specials for a number of years to follow, and typically these were used as a means for the locomotives and their volunteer support crews to make their way back down south after spending the summer operating to Mallaig. Steam operation was a huge hit in the Highlands, but at the same time there was further rationalisation, with more of the rural stations becoming unstaffed, and between 1987 and 88 the introduction of RETB, Radio Electronic Token Block signalling. Trains would now have their movements controlled by radio, to a new control centre at Banavie on the Mallaig line, resulting in the closure of almost all of the signal boxes north of Craigandorran. This inevitably cut costs and helped safeguard the future of the West Highland Railways, but on the understanding that all locomotives now had to be fitted with radio equipment to work the lines. It's a method which continues to this day, with all drivers now required to stop and gain a virtual token from the signaller before proceeding on to the next single track section.
Long section token on display, over.
3630 long section confirmed. Permission to pass down Rannoch, passes down crowd, please down tunnel. 3630 confirmed.
So pretty much overnight, the West Highland routes were down to about a 50% reduction in service, and this meant only a handful of trains running north of Craig and Doran each day. So let's have a wander into the old signal box. Looking inside, you can get somewhat a view of what the signaller would have.